Elena and the Gravedigger. Written by Christopher G. Smith. Chapter 1. Elena returns from the dead. Had a dream that I was a gravedigger. It started out with me alone in a dark, spooky graveyard tending to the graves as normal until Elena raised from her grave and grabbed my leg, and I demanded that she let go, but she refused, so I hit her over the head with my shovel. However, that failed to stop her. She demanded that I get her a cannoli or else she would eat my brain. So I said to her that I will get you a cannoli if you let go of my leg. She then shook her head in agreement and released my leg. I backed away from her and saw that she had broken glasses and one eyeball. She glared back at me as if she was waiting for me to fulfill her request. I just couldn't believe what had transpired and thought to myself, this isn't what I signed up for when I took this job. I then looked away from her zombie-ish corpse and ran into town to get her cannoli. After a while, I finally came upon a bakery that made cannolis. I went inside and said to the baker, "Quick, I need a cannoli." The baker looked at me like I was nuts, but how could I tell him that my friend had risen from her grave and would eat my brain if I didn't do as she said? So I made up a lie and said, "Look, I just really need a snack." He says to me, "Look, I don't have much time before closing." So he gives me the last 3 cannolis from the counter. I pay him and then make my way back to Elena's grave. On the way back to her grave, I noticed that my ex-friend Danny's grave was not too far from Elena's grave. I stopped and looked at Danny's grave, and I saw that her stone read, "Here lies Danny. She was stabbed by an unknown killer." However, I know it was me that killed her, but I was never found out. I walked away from her grave and returned to Elena's grave to find her just peacefully sitting up against her headstone. I went up to her and handed her a cannoli. She takes it, and then I give her one more. She eats her cannolis. I then sit in front of her and I eat my cannoli. After we're done with our cannolis, I stand back and I grab my shovel once again and I ask her, "Do you have any more demands for me?" She says no, and she goes back into her grave and I bury her. After I finished re-entombing her, I doused her grave with holy water and then drew a cross on her stone to ensure she would finally lay her soul to rest and never return to this mortal plane. End of Chapter 1. Elena and the Gravedigger. Chapter 2. Elena's Revenge. A month after my first encounter with Elena, I found myself in the same graveyard yet again. I couldn't help but think about her and how her missing I filled me with fear. I went over to her grave and saw that the cross that I had drawn faded away. Upon realizing this, I noticed that it was deathly quiet and I was starting to feel a sense of dread overcoming me. The full moon came into view as the clouds parted. In the distance, I heard a church bell ring out into the night. Then the very ground below me started to shake as if something or someone was trying to dig its way out. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my leg much like the last time. Instantly, I knew it was her. Elena yet again. She was trying to tread on this mortal plane. She started to pull on my leg in an attempt to free herself from the grave. I tried to shake her off, but she wouldn't let go. She then pulled herself all the way up. She stood up and looked me straight in the eyes. I too stare at her, looking right into her one good eye and her empty eye socket. I then asked, "How did you come back?" "I thought you laid your soul to rest." She laughs and says, "Did you really think you saw the last of me? I have unfinished business here. I've got to find the one who took my eye out." I then asked her, "Do you know who did it?" She nods and says, "It was my best friend James. At least I thought he was until he turned on me. He jabbed my eye and pulled it out with a sharp object after we had a fight. It was that fight that resulted in my death." I stare at her in shock after hearing this. "I thought James was your best friend. It never occurred to me that he could kill someone in cold blood. He must be a sick, twisted psychopath just to fight, kill, and then take your eye. Lucky for you, I know where he lives." Elena grins and laughs. "Take me to him," she says. I think to myself, why should I show a zombie-like corpse the way to her murderer's apartment? But at the same time, I don't want to know what happens if I don't. "Okay, I'll take you to him." Elena grabs my hand. It's cold and rotting, yet it's still solid enough that I can hold her hand without damaging it. We make our way to James's apartment. When we finally get to the door of his apartment, I look at Elena as she knocks on the door, and I know what she's about to do isn't gonna be pleasant. James opens the door and takes one look at Elena and faints. Elena drags him over to his couch and removes one of his eyes, then leaves him there dead. I turn to Elena and say, "What do we do now? You seem to have tied up all of your loose ends together." She laughs and says, "We'll leave James's body here, and you'll come with me back to the graveyard to bury me." We leave the apartment and make our way back to the graveyard. Elena follows me back to the graveyard. Once there, she lays herself back in her grave. As soon as she settled down, I started to rebury her once more and seal the grave shut. "Until we meet again," I said as I finished re-entombing her body. End of chapter 2. Elena and the Gravedigger. Chapter 3. Anna's Seance. Elena had been back in her grave for over a year, and yet again Christopher has found himself at her grave once more. However, on this day, he was tasked with moving her body to a newly built mausoleum. Deep down, he wished he didn't have to do this, but management left him no choice in the matter. So Christopher started to dig up the grave, and after digging it up, he noticed there was someone coming up the hill. It was a woman slightly older than him, and she was coming toward the now dug-up grave. Christopher looks at Elena's coffin and hopes whoever this is won't be upset by the open grave. The woman came right up to him and said, "My name is Anna, and I heard this grave was being opened." "Yes, it is," says Christopher. Anna looks down at the coffin, then back up at the gravestone. "Will she be moved to the mausoleum today and will be done by midnight?" Anna asks. "Yes, but why?" says Christopher. "My reason for asking is that I want to do a seance in the mausoleum." She says a quick prayer, then walks away. Christopher found that prayer to be a bit odd. He thought to himself it must have been a Wiccan prayer or something. You never know with people who wear all black and have never tanned. Christopher looked down at the open grave, then back up, and saw the other gravediggers coming over with an excavator and ropes to lift the coffin. Christopher took a deep breath and got back to work. Thanks to the others' help, he got the job done in time for nightfall. They quickly moved the coffin inside the mausoleum. After setting the coffin down, a clock tower could be heard tolling midnight. The other gravediggers left, but Christopher stayed in the mausoleum. After some time, he hears the door of the mausoleum open and shut. He turns around to see Anna and two of her friends coming inside. Anna says to Christopher, "Join us." They all sit around the coffin and join hands. Christopher was the most nervous in the group. He didn't want the seance to take place. However, he felt that he had no choice in this, so he went through with it. Even still, deep down, he knew this was a bad idea. He rather not speak of his previous experiences with Elena. Anna started the seance, and everything started out fine until they attempted to contact Elena's spirit. The supernatural act in the mausoleum got worse and worse. First, the door slammed and locked, then Elena's coffin sprung open quickly. Elena sat up in the coffin slowly and looked around the room and locked her eyes on Anna. She got out of the coffin and stood up, then went right up to Anna and said, "I remember you drove me crazy in life, and I hated you." Anna turned super pale and completely froze up from fear. She then said, "Elena, why do you have an empty eye socket, and why is there an eye tied around your neck on that string?" Elena replies with, "Well, you remember James, he took one of my eyes, so I took one of his eyes." Elena then grabs Anna's shoulders and drags her outside to the now empty grave, then pushes Anna into it and starts to fill it in with dirt. Elena then calls out to me and orders me to fill in the grave. I feel that I don't have much of a choice. So I did as asked, and after a while Anna was completely buried in the grave. Elena then asks for a paintbrush and some black paint. I give the items to her and she takes them. Elena takes the paint and brush and crosses out her name, then paints Anna's name onto the gravestone. We then return to the mausoleum and see that everyone else has left. Elena then turns to me and forces me into an open coffin and says, "Stay there." She doesn't close the coffin lid over, so I sit up and watch her. She walks around the mausoleum as if she is trying to familiarize herself with the room. She then locks the door before climbing back into her coffin and shutting the lid back over her. The room gets deathly quiet, and I have no possible way of escaping because Elena has the key in her coffin. I can't do anything about this situation. So I lay down in the coffin and close my eyes, and I stay there hoping someone will realize that I've gone missing. Hopefully the air doesn't run out before I can be saved. End of chapter 3. Elena and the Gravedigger. Chapter 4. Gravedigger. Christopher wakes up the next day to the sound of knocking on the mausoleum door and someone shouting his name. He realized that he had been here for quite some time, and he was glad that the air in the room had not run out, which he found surprising considering there were no windows or any kind of ventilation. After collecting himself, Christopher climbed out of the coffin, then walked over to Elena's coffin and carefully opened it. He reached into the coffin and grabbed the key for the door. Christopher slowly closed the coffin and went over to the door and unlocked it. However, the person who was knocking had already moved on to somewhere else. Christopher realized his shift had been over since sunrise, so he decided to go home and get some much-needed sleep in his real bed. I mean, come on, let's face it, a coffin isn't comfy as it looks. He exits the mausoleum and heads toward the big iron gate of the graveyard. Christopher heads home and doesn't stop for anything. He was very tired and in discomfort from sleeping in that coffin all night. At least when he got home, there would be a real bed that he could sleep in. An hour later, Christopher was back at his home. He opens the door and goes to the table, on which he finds a note that reads, "I know you left the mausoleum. I told you to stay put, but you didn't, and now I'm coming for you. Signed with love, Elena." Christopher drops the note and goes to his bedroom and locks the door. He goes to bed and closes his eyes, hoping Elena doesn't find him. Christopher had a feeling that whatever happens during his next shift won't be pleasant, and he will surely die. End of chapter 4. Elena and the Gravedigger. Chapter 5. Christopher's last night. Christopher's alarm clock sounded loudly at the strike of midnight like it always does. However, this night would be different. He got out of bed to start his shift at the graveyard. He was still thinking about the note he found on his table. "I should check the mausoleum," he said to himself. An hour later, he's at the mausoleum. He opens the door and goes over to Elena's coffin, but when he opens it, much to his surprise, it's empty. Oh no, she isn't here. He then finds a note in the coffin. It reads, "I'm coming for you." He rips up the note and tries to laugh it off, but he still feels uneasy by it. He hears a loud noise from behind him, then a cold hand touches his shoulder. Christopher freezes as he knows this is Elena. She walks around him to look him straight in the eyes. "I told you to stay where you were, but you didn't," she said. "Please, Elena, don't kill me. I've loved and respected you. Why do you have to kill me?" He cried. Elena laughs. "Did you really think I would let you live after not doing what you were told?" She places her hand on Christopher's chest. Then he starts to feel weak. Her touch is like the touch of death, draining his life force. It gets harder and harder to breathe. His heart starts to stress from struggling to pump his blood. He turns white as a sheet in a matter of minutes. Elena's grip on his chest increases, and he starts to cough and wheeze for air. Unfortunately for him, he just can't catch a single breath of air and finally lets out one last gasp as he falls to the floor. Elena stood over his dead body, then lifted him up and placed him in a coffin. After setting his body down, she stood there thinking about what she just did. Elena looked at Christopher, then at herself, and realized that her body was wearing out and she couldn't keep rising from the dead. Once again, she looks at Christopher and cries a little as she closes his coffin. Elena turns around and goes back to her coffin and gets in it, then closes it, never to rise from the dead again. Just as she closed her coffin, she heard two people come into the mausoleum. Their voices were familiar. Elena recognizes them as her older brother Michael and sister-in-law Ankita. They must have been the ones that arranged for the mausoleum to be built. She heard them step in front of her coffin. Her brother placed some flowers on top of the coffin and said a few words. Then both said, "Rest in peace, Elena." They cried a little, then left and closed the mausoleum door behind them. Once Elena was sure that everyone left, she finally decided to let her soul go and let herself rest forevermore. The end.
Stay tuned to see what comes down the line next on Chris's 2.